nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurum īśvaram. Itam Śrī Radhika prana nātapada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Śrī Gurum bhaje. Śrī Govinda pararavinda marupananyabhilashojitam purna prema rasotsavo jalamano vritti prasannananam. Shajvad Krishna katha mahamritapayo rasho muda kedato bande bhagavatam iman anudavam mudna nipatyakshito. Namo mahavaranyaya Krishna prema pradayate Krishnaya Krishna chaitanya namne gaura tvishe namah. Jayatam surato pangor mama mandamater gati matsarvasva parambojo radha madana mohano kuladi devatamar madana mohan jar sevak raghunatha rup sanatan jaya rupa sanatana bhatta raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Bandhan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Shrimad Rupa Parambhojo Rajoham Sambhave Bhave. Abhirapali patiputra kanta tasya bilashati balashvavara Shri Rupa Chinta malasapti sangsto dur matsvanta durdhanta haichurastam Raganugami bhajano lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya sahasara smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Yaram Yanikilaga Sangha Shamani Shotratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata hiraye vrajendra tanuja premamrita syandini saji yad hari bhakta vrinda mohita dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we'll absorb ourselves in discussion of Padyavali. And we're in the Bhakta Mahatmya Prakaranam, this section discussing the greatness of Bhaktas. So today we'll discuss the remaining 2 verses in this Prakaran. In the last class we heard about the greatness of Bhaktas indicated by means of their disinterestedness in everything of the mundane, their disinterestedness in everything other than their bhakti to Bhagavan. In other words, an indirect description of the purity of their one-pointedness upon Bhagavan. So today we'll hear some further greatnesses of these Bhaktas. So I start from verse 57. Next, the compiler cites a verse that describes the greatness of Bhaktas by explaining how realization of the essential nature or tattva of Sri Bhagavan cannot come about without one attaining the association of Sri Bhagavan's Bhaktas. So not only do these Bhaktas themselves know the essential nature of Bhagavan, who is considered in the view of Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami and company, the foremost self-manifestation of the ultimate reality, or the paratattva. But these bhaktas are such that they can convey such realization or such experience to others. And not only can they convey it, but they're the only ones who can convey it, such that it is only by approaching such bhaktas, it is only by receiving the grace, the teaching, the association and so forth of such bhaktas, that others can come to have realization of that ultimate spiritual object. So who could be greater than them? Or, in other words, what greater persons could there be if it's only in the company of such persons that one can come to experience the ultimate state of fulfillment? So, how is this? Why is this? This will be explained in the present verse. So, a verse of Madhava Saraswati as follows. Mīmāṁsā-rajasā malīmāṁsā-dṛśāṁ tāvan dhīr īśvare garvodarka-kutarka-karkaśa-dhiyāṁ dūre'pi vārttā hareḥ jānanto'pi na jānate śruti-sukhaṁ śrī-raṅgi-saṅgād susvāduṁ pariveṣayanty rasaṁ gurvī na darvī spṛśet. So he says the following. The mind of those whose eyes are soiled by the dust of mīmāṁsā are not fixed upon Īśvara. Tidings of Hari remain afar from those whose minds are hardened by spurious argumentation arising from pride. And even those who know the joy of the Śrutis do not truly know the object described within them, so long as they remain devoid of the association of the devotees of Śrī Raṅga. Just as an excellent ladle, even while distributing the most relishable rasa, cannot touch it. So, oh dear, the file is not there. One sec. Let me see here. Okay, just give me a sec, I'll put it up. Sorry about that. Okay, should be in the folder now. So, I'll read this one more time. The mind of those whose eyes are soiled by the dust of mīmāṁsā are not fixed upon Īśvara. Tidings of Hari remain afar from those whose minds are hardened by spurious argumentation arising from pride. And even those who know the joy of the Śrutis do not truly know the ultimate object described therein, so long as they remain devoid of the association of the devotees of Śrī Raṅga. Just as an excellent ladle, even while distributing the most relishable rasa, cannot touch it. So here, by touch, it means taste, as will be explained ahead. So a spoon can distribute excellent rasa or excellent dishes, excellent preparations of desserts or foods or what have you, but although it holds them, it doesn't get to taste them, or it doesn't get the real experience of them, even though it's directly in contact with them. So there's no doubt that it has some touch or some experience of them, but that experience is not real experience. That experience is not the definitive experience that really determines or really enables one to have genuinely experienced the element, so to speak. So similarly, here this verse, using, poetic language, is speaking of mīmāṁsakas, nyāyayikas, and Vedantis, in particular those following the Advaita Marg of the Uttar-mīmāṁsa. So the mīmāṁsakas, the nyāyayikas, and the Uttar-mīmāṁsakas, or the Advaitavadis, none of them truly know, or none of them truly experience Bhagavan, or the beauty of bhakti rasa. So how is this? Why is this? We'll discuss in the commentary. Mīmāṁsa here refers to purva-mīmāṁsa, which is also known as karma-mīmāṁsa, the philosophical system, or darshan, that focuses on teaching the karma kanda, that is, the portion of the Vedas that describes performance of rituals, and propounds karma to be the ultimate means to well-being. Mīmāṁsa is compared to dust here because it is considered to contaminate and obstruct the, quote, eye of knowledge, just as dust contaminates and obstructs the physical eye, insofar as it in no way supports adherence to the path of Bhagavad Bhakti, and, for example, can promote forms of offense, aparad, such as the notion that the statements in the Shastra that describe the effects of performing acts of Bhagavad Bhakti, such as chanting Sri Bhagavan's name, are forms of artavad, that is, mere unreal exaggerations. Followers of Purva-mīmāṁsa, who are loosely known as karmis, are thus described in the verse as being those whose minds are not fixed upon Īśvara. So the Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan is very intricate. It has many principles or hermeneutics which have been adopted by the Uttar-mīmāṁsa discourse, and on the basis of that also in Vaishnava discourse, and in particular by Jiva Goswami and Gaudiya Vaishnavacharjas. So the Gaudiya Vaishnavas do have a debt, so to speak, or they do have regard for some features of what is taught in Purva-mīmāṁsa, and some general acquaintance with Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan is also helpful to understand Srimad Bhagavatam and understand the significance of Uttar-mīmāṁsa and specifically Vaishnava viewpoints on Vedanta. So we don't want to paint a picture like, that there's nothing of value there, nothing worthy of respect. Not like that. However, if one becomes completely adherent to what is described in the Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan, then that will ultimately inhibit one from taking to the path of bhakti. Because in the view of the karma-mīmāṁsakas, bhakti is not the purushartha, prema is not the purushartha, Bhagavan is not the supreme feature of the paratattva, etc. All of the principal features of Vaishnava and specifically Gaudiya Vaishnava theology are not a focus there. And rather by staunch adherence only to the pramanas accepted in the Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan, one won't accept the pramanas that lead to acceptance of these conclusions, and therefore one won't acquire shraddha in bhakti, and as we've discussed in many cases, without shraddha, one is not eligible for the path of bhakti, and without being eligible for the path of bhakti, one will not follow the path of bhakti, and without following the path of bhakti, one will not get the result of following that path, namely experience of Bhagavan, experience of his madhurya, experience of prem, etc. So, for those who hold those ideals dear, or those who have embraced prem bhakti as the experience of Krishna's madhurya as the supreme purushartha, then this Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan will be recognized as an obstruction to that, or something that can inhibit one from recognizing that or those ideals as being, quote, highest or most worthy of acceptance. So the poet here uses this analogy of dust in the eyes. Just as when you have dust in your eyes you can't see, similarly when you accept only the pramanas that are accepted in the Purva-mīmāṁsa darshan, you are blocked or you're inhibited from quote-unquote seeing or having the, valid means of acquiring valid knowledge, or pramanas means by which one can perceive Bhagavan, bhakti, and so forth as they are. So, in that sense, the commentator refers to that, you could say, epistemological, that alternate epistemological footing, to put it politely perhaps, as dust in the eyes, so to speak. And we see that there was, in classical times, definitely debate, or definitely, vivid differences between the Bhaktas and the mīmāṁsakas. In Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, we see multiple places where he's, speaking about these mīmāṁsakas as, as being persons whose, flaming tongue, the fire on whose flaming tongues, that let this fire be extinguished by the nectar of bhakti rasa. Or, in other words, if they, dryly and ardently, intellectually stick to their pramanas, then they inhibit themselves from ever tasting this nectar of bhakti rasa. So their, argumentation is compared to like a fire on the tongue, which can only be truly extinguished by experience. In other words, people can argue about it unlimitedly. One can present all kinds of arguments to them, but it's not ultimate argumentation which will settle the matter unless and until people have experience. Then the undercurrent of that argument isn't fully extinguished, so to speak. So to also encourage persons in the middle, so to speak, to say, don't bother yourself with these debates, rather come and pursue the path of bhakti, have experience of the path of bhakti, and let the fulfillment that it produces be the proof in the pudding, so to speak. Like this, Rupa Goswami makes remarks in the Sindhu as well. So, he had precedent for them, so to speak, in a citation like he's giving here. So that's one element, the mīmāṁsas. Now let's come to the second one. Those whose minds are hardened by spurious argumentation, or quote, kutarka, refers to nyāyayikas and vaisheshikas. That is, those who follow the treatises written by Gautam and Kanada, which are known as Hetu Shastra and Nyaya Shastra. Generally speaking, knowledge of grammar and logic are helpful in understanding all types of shastra, including bhakti shastras. And there's a saying to this effect: the work of Kanada, that is the Vaisheshika darshan, and loosely Nyaya darshan and logic in general, and the work of Panini, that is Bhakaran, meaning loosely grammar in general, are helpful in all shastras, or all fields of knowledge. In other words, if one doesn't know grammar, and one doesn't know how to organize one's thoughts logically, you're not going to understand anything, be it bhakti or Vedanta or what have you. So some fundamental ability to learn how to think is necessary to understand anything. And there's nothing more fundamental to structuring your thoughts than understanding grammar, since thought and language are inherently intertwined. And moreover, to understand how to infer things properly or accurately, how to understand, praman, prameya, etc. This is dealt with in the work of Kanada, or more broadly in Vaisheshika and Nyaya. So some fundamental understanding of this is necessary. And therefore, Jiva Goswami wrote the Harinamrita Bhakaran, therefore Jiva Goswami wrote the Sarvasamvadani, therefore he spent time to teach perspective, to provide for posterity, to provide for those who aspired to follow the path of Uttam Bhakti, understanding of Bhakaran, understanding of hermeneutics, understanding of pramana, all of these things. These are important. So here by saying those whose minds are hardened by spurious argumentation, doesn't mean that one has to write off Nyaya completely, or to say that any type of tarka is kutarka, as sometimes can be, problematic, but rather there's a distinction between what is called anukul tarka and kutarka. In other words, not all argumentation or reasoning is the same. It's not just one catch-all category. Although in the Charitamrita and other places we see sometimes Bhaktas speaking deprecatingly of tarka, it has to be understood that when they say tarka there, they mean kutarka, not all tarka. Another synonym for the word tarka is yukti. And as we see in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and as will be discussed soon in the classes we have on that text, yukti, or tarka, is one of the aspects of eligibility for the path of bhakti. In other words, to understand tarka or yukti properly makes you a greater adhikari for the path of bhakti. It's necessary to know to some extent. And in the Laghu Bhagavatamrita also, Rupa Goswami himself cites a passage which explains that there's a distinction between what is called anukul tarka and kutarka. And anukul tarka is understood to mean tarka which draws out the tatparya, that is the intended sense, of statements in the Shastra in context as per what precedes and follows them. So it's impossible to understand any text without interpreting it, and it's impossible to interpret it without using some type of methodology. So you need to know the methodology. In other words, you need to learn what is called, the tatparya nirnoy padati, or the process by which the meaning of statements is determined. So if one thinks, I can understand, and doesn't follow and learn this whole refined system of how to do that, just thinks, you just hear and you just understand it all. This is, the epitome of not understanding. In other words, to assume that it's so simple that you can just understand without having been taught the process of understanding, this is problematic, and, is where it's hard to say if there's exactly a distinction between ignorance and arrogance, or whether it's both. Insofar as, those who really don't know much assume that there isn't that much to know, or they're not yet aware of how little they know, in contrast to the famous statement of Einstein, after being praised for how much he knows, he says, I've come to realize that I've collected a few pebbles on the shore of knowledge. In other words, to know is to understand how much subtlety, how much depth there is in the field of what is to be known. So to think that one can understand things without learning the process of understanding, in other words, to think that one can think without learning how to think, shows they haven't thought very far. Anyway, I don't want to elaborate excessively. The point I'm just bringing out is that there's a distinction between anukul tarka and kutarka. Tarka is synonymous with yukti. Yukti is one of the features of adhikar for bhakti, as explained by Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, and Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami. So, in contrast to that yukti, or that anukul tarka, which is part of being eligible for bhakti and which greatly enhances one's capability to follow the path of bhakti, there is kutarka. In other words, there's, misapplying one's analysis such that it leads to misunderstanding of the Shastra, or such that it inhibits any proper understanding. So he considers here that the Nyayayikas and Vaisheshikas their approach is categorically regarded as kutarka. In other words, their method of reasoning is not anukul to the Shastra, it's pratikul. So because it's not anukul tarka, it's what you could call pratikul tarka, or rather than being favorable argumentation, it's unfavorable argumentation. It's therefore considered spurious. So how is that? Let's explain a little further. When, however, one's mind becomes hardened by spurious argumentation arising from pride, that is, when reasoning alone is regarded as a means to understanding ultimate reality, and one thus disregards the authoritativeness of, and possibility for self-manifest revelation through, the Vedas, Puranas, and other Shastras, then, quote, tidings of Hari remain afar. That is, then one is inhibited from hearing and studying teachings regarding Bhagavad Bhakti with the conviction that is required to imbibe their import, and one typically lacks even interest to do so. In other words, tarka or yukti is anukul when it is used to arrive at the intention or the tatparya of the Shastra. But if it's used to controvert the tatparya of the Shastra, or it's used to deny the validity or the value of Shastra at all, if it's accepted as a praman independent of Shabda, or independent and superior to Shabda, then it inhibits experience of Bhagavan and Bhakti, because Bhakti, Bhagavan, these are based on Shabda praman or Shastra praman. They're things that can only be self-revealed. That which is not within the scope of the intellect and senses to directly perceive can only be known by a means that comes from outside of them. So it's only by Shabda that these things can be known. So to deny even that premise and to use Tarka reasoning for this purpose of denying that, is thus regarded as kutarka or spurious or unfavorable, because it's not, quote, anukul tarka, or it's not in support of understanding what is coming through Shabda praman. So because persons who don't even accept Shabda praman don't even want to hear Shabda, then how are they ever going to hear Harikatha, which is coming in the Shastra? They're not even going to listen. So therefore, quote, tidings of Hari remain afar. They only want to consider real or true what can be known by means of anuman and pratyaksha. So this is, from another perspective, the modern scientific method is essentially that. It's the exclusion of any quote-unquote bias or what would otherwise be called, a certain premises that come from sources that are considered revealed. And rather it simply says that whatever we can know with our empiric perception and our inferences based on that perception, that will label truth, or that will label real, and we won't allow our approaches or our inferences made in regard to our perceptions to be colored by texts or viewpoints that are thought to be revealed and which we can't corroborate value for based on our pre-existent perceptions and inferences based on those perceptions. So we're not here to deny that what you might call reductive epistemology of the scientific method also has its utility. And that, however, what we want to say is that the utility of that is circumscribed by its scope. In other words, it has utility in the plane of its application alone. But it's not a means to experience what is outside its scope, nor is it a means to deny the existence of things outside its scope. So to define Bhagavan as that which cannot be known by empiric perception and inference, and then to say Bhagavan doesn't exist because he can't be known by empiric perception and inference, leads to a categorical impasse. That which is defined as beyond the scope cannot be invalidated because it's not within the scope. So, to use those means in the pursuit of experiencing something outside their scope, that would be, to use anukul tarka, but to, refute the value or the potential value of experience of, or the pursuit of experience of anything outside that scope will be dubbed kutarka by those, obviously, who favor the pursuit of experience outside that scope, namely the Bhaktas, or all followers of all varieties of the Vedas and other revealed texts. So, a little more on this topic. Sri Sanatana Pad thus cites the following verse in this regard. Quote, Puranas, Pancharatras, Vedas, and Pashupatas. These are highly authoritative shastras, and should not be controverted with arguments. He comments, quote, should not be controverted with arguments, means should not be should not be controverted means should not be refuted, and, quote, with arguments means with spurious argumentation, or sophistry, that is, kutarka and sportive disputation. So here you have a statement where Sanatana Goswami is specifically, condemning or excluding the use of kutarka. In other words, the shastras, which are considered authoritative or considered to convey meaningful knowledge, they should be studied from the premise that there's something worthy of knowing in them, and argumentation or interpretation or reasoning should be applied to arrive at meaningful, useful knowledge, not simply to try to say that the text has nothing to contribute or nothing of value. So this informs the process whereby when one studies a text, which is considered to be of value, then one will always assume that there is a coherence to the text, a value to the text, and will interpret it such that one arrives at a conclusion that conveys value and significance. So one won't reductively think, oh, this is just a mistake, oh, this is just redundant, oh, this doesn't have any meaning. Rather, if in the course of studying a text such statements appear that way, then one will use yukti or tarka, in other words, hermeneutics, to refine one's understanding or adjust one's understanding such that a coherent and valuable conclusion is arrived at. So those things are all discussed in the Sarvasangvadani, many of the primary modes by which that is achieved. That's outside the scope of this discussion, but that's what's being referred to here. And secondly, a similar statement is in the Manusmriti, quote, a twice-born who disregards those two sources of instruction, that is the Shruti and Smriti, on account of adherence to Hetu Shastra, that is Nyaya Shastra, is an unbeliever, a defamer of the Veda, and to be shunned by sadhus. In other words, someone who won't accept the validity or the value of Shastra Praman or Shabda Praman, and say, I'm only going to rely on Nyaya, which is to say, I'm only going to rely on Anuman, and I deny the validity or the value of Shabda, then what is that person? They're a Nastika. So sometimes people think the word Nastika means atheist. It doesn't exactly mean atheist. It means rather someone who doesn't have Shraddha in Shastra. And thus, he says, they're a defamer of the Veda, or they're critical of the Veda, or they speak so as to denigrate respect for the Veda in society, and therefore sadhus, who are defined elsewhere by Sridhar Samipad as Shastra Nivartina, the followers of Shastra, then they shun such persons. So, lastly, I'll just add that the original statement here says, hardened by spurious argumentation arising from pride. In other words, why would someone adopt this reductive epistemology? Why would someone not wish to consider that they can be benefited by sources of knowledge coming through Shastra Praman and say, nope, with my Anuman and my Pratyaksha, I'm all good. I can just, with my direct sensory experiences and my inferences based on them, I'll know everything just with that. So what the author is trying to say is that this is an arrogant position, or this is a position of pride, to assume that I have within me full faculty to know everything that can be known, to know everything that's worth knowing. There's nothing beyond me that I could acquire that would benefit me in a way that I'm unable to benefit myself. Nothing is in it, which is to say, there's nothing greater than me and my own faculty. That's considered pride, or that's considered an arrogant stance. Whereas to say, yes, we should make use of our perceptions, yes, we should make use of our inference, but we should also accept the support of a source that comes from outside of ourselves and that may have a potential to benefit ourselves greater than even we can benefit our own selves. That will be regarded as a non-arrogant position, or rather a position of respect, a position of humility. So in this way, the bhakta, although they do make use of, quote, argumentation or tarka in one manner, they distance themselves from those who make use of it in a manner that's contrary to adherence to the Shastra. So the author thus far is thus saying, mīmāṁsakas, nyāyāyikas, their positions are different than that of the Bhaktas. The minds of the Nyāyikas are hardened. In other words, they're not receptive or soft or accepting of Shastra Praman, of other sources beyond that of their own intellect and, cognitions of their perceptions. And the mīmāṁsakas are blind. Although the mīmāṁsakas do accept the authority of Shastra, they're blinded by, or they're unable to see what's being taught in the Shastra because of their preoccupation with karma and their non-acceptance of the aspect taught in the Shastras of bhakti and Bhagavan specifically. So now he comes to a third category, the uttar mīmāṁsakas, or the Vedantis. So he says, even those who know the joy of the Śrutis refers to Vedantis, that is, uttar mīmāṁsakas. And now there's a variant here. The critical edition has the phrase śruti-sukhaṁ, but the commentator, he comments on it as though the text was written śruti-mukhaṁ. So one letter, an M or an S, which do look similar in Bengali script, is the difference. So perhaps there was a typist error somewhere in the centuries. In any case, śruti-mukhaṁ or śruti-sukhaṁ. So one meaning is whether they know the sukha of the Śrutis, or the joy that's described, or the joy that's in the Śrutis, which is an allusion to Brahman, or whether they know śruti-mukhaṁ. So the word mukh, sometimes people think means face, but it's also used for the head of something, and just as in English we might say, so-and-so is the head of the department. Doesn't mean that he literally is the head and not the body or something. It means he's the leader, or he's the foremost person in the department. So the word mukham also has that type of usage in Sanskrit, the way we use the word head in English. So to say śruti-mukham thus refers to the best or the main Śrutis among all the other Śruti texts. So in that sense, the meaning would become, in the case of the variant śruti-mukham, quote, even those who know the foremost of the Śrutis. So both meanings could work, because he's trying to refer to uttar mīmāṁsakas. And generally, the Upanishads and the Vedanta are considered the foremost of the Shastras, or the most esoteric or greatest Shastras. So the word śruti-mukham would be applicable to make it clear he's speaking about Vedantis. But from another perspective, the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks about Brahman as the Ananda of the highest order, which supersedes any Ananda found in any loka within the Brahmanda. So the true Sukha or Ananda of the Śruti is Brahman. And who knows that? The Vedantis, the uttar mīmāṁsakas, the Gyanis, not the Karmis, who are interested in going to Svarga or Maharloka or these other places. It's only the Gyanis, it's only the uttar mīmāṁsakas who know that, the true or the ultimate sukh of the Shastra, namely Brahman. So that could also be used as a distinguisher of the uttar mīmāṁsakas. Therefore, we'll consider them variants, or in other words, it might be either. Both convey something useful. Regardless, these uttar mīmāṁsakas, who are loosely known as Gyanis, and who principally study the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutras, and seek to realize undifferentiated or nirvishesh Brahman, are said in the verse to, quote, not know, because they regard Bhagavan Shri Krishna, the ultimate aspect of the ultimate reality, or paratattva, because they do not regard Bhagavan to be, meaning as, the ultimate reality, as is indicated in statements such as that of Shri Krishna himself in the Bhagavad Gita, where he says, Vedaśtyaham eva sarva vedyo. I alone am the object to be known by all the Vedas. So what is to be known by the Śrutis or the Vedas? Me, Krishna. So if these Gyanis, they are said to know all the Śrutis, or to know the greatest of the Śrutis, the Upanishads, but they don't know Krishna, they don't recognize Krishna to be Parabrahman himself, or they don't recognize Bhagavan to be the essence of what is called Parabrahman. Rather, they consider Nirvishesh Brahman or Nishakti Nirvikar Brahman to be paramount. Then, although they know, they don't know. So thus he says, they may know the Shastra, but they don't actually know, in the sense that they haven't grasped its import in the true sense, as per the way the Bhaktas see it, and as per the indication by reference to the statement of the Gita that he cites here. So these Gyanis, these Uttar Mīmāṁsikas, who are no doubt super educated and know their Shastras extremely well, nevertheless haven't arrived at the ultimate object that the Shastras describe in a manner that leads to the most profound experience of it, which is regarded as the most self-fulfilling and meaningful experience of the highest value, and thus to be acquainted with true experience or true knowledge thereof. So, after thus summarizing the mentalities of karmis, nyayikas, and gyanis, the author explains the reason they retain these mentalities. So why did these people carry on as they do? He says, so long as they remain devoid of the association of the devotees of Śrī Raṅga. In other words, you can carry on like that. It has its own logic, it has its own charm, it has its own utility, not denied. But if you get the association of a bhakta, if you get the association of someone who can convey something of the beauty, the value of the path of bhakti, then at that point, someone may recognize there's something of a greater alternative to what they're practicing at present. So he says, why do people continue to remain karmis, nyayikas, and gyanis? Because they didn't get the sangha of a bhakta. And he speaks of them, he speaks of bhaktas as, quote, śrī-raṅgi. So Bhagavan is known as Śrī Raṅga, on account of his being, quote, he whose merriment, or Raṅga, is with Śrī, that is, Lakshmi. So as in South India, there's a very famous temple which was visited by Mahaprabhu, where Ramanujacharya, Jamunacharya, many other great Mahatmas have lived, that is called Śrī-Raṅgam, or Ranganath. So Śrī Raṅga here is a name of Vishnu, or considered a name of Vishnu, where it means he whose Raṅga, or whose merriment, or whose play, whose excitement, is with or because of Śrī, meaning Lakshmi. So similar to the name Lakshmi Kanta, or something like this. So then a śrī-raṅgi would mean one who is devoted to, or one who is a bhakta of that Śrī Raṅga. And those who regard him as their object of worship, that is his bhaktas, are thus known as śrī-raṅgis. When gyanis, for example, do not receive the fortune of having association with Sri Bhagavan's bhaktas, then the result of their study, contemplation, and meditation on the Śrutis and other Shastras is relish for mukti, rather than bhakti, even if they hear descriptions of Sri Bhagavan, his bhaktas, their relations and leelas together, and other such topics that bhaktas recognize and relish as exalting Sri Bhagavan and bhakti as the ultimate spiritual attainments. So in other words, it's not just that they didn't hear the Bhagavatam or they didn't hear Shastras that spoke about Bhagavan and bhakti. Rather, especially Gyanis are well acquainted with those texts, but they consider them to be part of the path of Gyan, or they practice what we dub Bhakti Mishra Gyan, or the path of Gyan mixed with the practice of Bhakti, as was shown by Shankaracharya, and as has been developed by many of his generations of his later followers, whereby Bhakti is practiced as part of the path of the Gyanamarg, with the aim of ultimately realizing Nirvishesh Brahman. So it's not that they don't, quote, know who is Bhagavan, or they don't, quote, know what is Bhakti, But unless they get the association of a bhakta, then the experience of the preeminence of bhakti and Bhagavan as something that eclipses in value even the Jnana Marg and even the object of Brahman as one's ultimate, object of aspired for realization, that won't come about. This is what the author wants to say, is that one needs the association of such a bhakta to become acquainted with or to acquire the samskar such that one can experience bhakti and Bhagavan to be superlatives. So the author thus gives an example to illustrate how karmis, nyayayikas, and jnanis can hear about Sri Bhagavan and bhakti in the Shastra and yet still not attain paramount regard and relish for them. So persons existing within, the Indian subcontinent for centuries upon centuries, it's not that they've never heard of Bhagavan, or they've never heard of Krishna, or they've never heard of Ram, or they've never heard of Vishnu. They've heard. But although they've heard, they haven't heard. Or although they know, they don't know. Or although they have some experience of what that is, they don't have the experience, or they don't have experience of an order of value that leads them to perceive bhakti and Bhagavan as an ideal that eclipses all else. So what's their experience like then? He gives the analogy. Just as an excellent ladle, even while distributing the most relishable rasa, cannot touch it. That is, just as a ladle, because it is unconscious, cannot touch, that is, actually taste, the rasa that it holds and serves to others. So they may speak about Bhagavan, they may teach the Bhagavatam, they may do things like this, even if they're distributing these things. Nevertheless, they don't actually taste them, or they don't actually experience them in truth. The implication is thus that the association of bhaktas is like consciousness. That is, it brings about the capacity to be aware of, so as to truly relish, the paramount joy found in Sri Bhagavan and bhakti to him, as is indicated in the Bhagavatam. So just if as a ladle is unconscious, if it could somehow become conscious, then it could, experience, so to speak, the rasa, or the soup, or the vegetables, or the dessert that it's serving. Similarly, these persons who lack the association of bhaktas are compared to being, in touch with these things, but not conscious of them, and that then the association of a bhakta brings this consciousness to them, which essentially means a bhakti samskar. So as Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami have indicated, that the great fortune that is the basis of someone taking to the path of bhakti or acquiring eligibility for the path of bhakti is mahat samskar adi vishesh, the samskar which is produced by the association of a mahat. So that's referred to in this passage from the Bhagavad. Quote, when the cessation of worldly existence shall come about for a wandering person, then, O Achyuta, association with the Sat shall come about. And when association with the Sat shall come about, only then does inclination manifest towards you, who are the shelter of the Sat and the master of all the higher and lower entities throughout all planes of existence. So this is a verse we discussed at length in our classes on the Charitamrita with all the Acharya's tikas. I won't go into it here. But the point is that when he says, only then does inclination manifest towards you, means only then does the propensity or the proclivity to follow the path of bhakti come about. Only when one gets that sadhu sangha, or sangha of the bhakta. So, in summary, this verse is cited by Rupa Goswami Pad to show the greatness of bhaktas, to show that one won't realize who is Bhagavan, or one won't take to the path of bhakti without the association of such bhaktas. Persons may be cultured, they may have great chitta shuddhi, they may be highly learned, they may have faith in Shastra in some respect, what have you. But unless they get the Bhakta Sangha, they won't get to relish and experience this ultimate feature of the Paratattva, namely Bhakti and Bhagavan. So this is, in short, the point, and obviously the distinction between the path of Bhakti and the path of Purva Mīmāṁsā or Avurtam Mīmāṁsā or all of these things can be elaborated on in further detail. Much of these points come out in the course of the Sarva-samvadani and other points made by Jiva Goswami. It's not within the scope of this discussion to go into a high level of detail. Okay, so we have one last verse of this prakaran, so we'll look at that. Next, the compiler cites a verse that describes the greatness of bhaktas by describing the absence of relish for other paths felt by those who consider themselves fulfilled just by receiving the favor of bhaktas. So this is like a corollary verse. In other words, without the association of a bhakta, one will remain a karmi, a nyayika, or a jnani. But when someone gets that association with the bhakta, then one only wants to be a bhakta. One doesn't want to be a karmi, one doesn't want to be a jnani, one doesn't want to be a nyayika, or what have you. So this verse shows the nishta, or the attitude that emerges from those who got that samskar from the mahat, who took to the path of bhakti. So they say this, they remark as follows. Dhyanavalambaka kechit karmavalambaka vayam tu hari-dāsānāṁ paratrāṇavalambaka. Some are adherents of jnana, some are adherents of karma. We, however, are adherents of the shoes of Hari's servants. You may follow Gyan, you may follow Gyan, you may follow karma, I follow bhaktas. Or I follow the shoes on the feet of those bhaktas. In other words, with great adoration, I like to follow what I've learned from bhaktas. This, in gist, is what is conveyed. Although there is an alternate meaning, which we'll look at in the commentary. So, the mention of some being adherents of jnana and karma, which can refer to the paths of jnana and karma in general, or to the jnana and karma khandas of the Vedas, is in the spirit of, quote, let those who are such be such. Meaning, the author is neither inclined to be like them, nor inclined to dissuade them from remaining as they are. So this is an important point. When one is satisfied, when one has conviction in something, even if other people don't accept it, it doesn't bother them. If one is bothered by the fact that others don't accept or don't have a matching conviction, in many cases that can be because of an insecurity or a doubt about one's own path within one's own self. Academic research on religious conversion, things like that show that typically fanaticism is found upon those who are far less educated about their own religion than those who are highly educated in it. That the oversimplistic notions are rigid and therefore, feel fragile or feel threatened by so many other elements in the environment or in society. But those who have a deep-rooted, broad-scoped, nuanced understanding, they're not disturbed by the fact that others may think otherwise or by so many other attitudes that may be out there, because they've taken the time and they've done the work to process those things, to contemplate those things, to deliberate on those things, and arrive at an understanding and a conviction that is vetted and has, validity in the sense of it having been subjected to rational analysis, as well as, personal consideration of value, so to speak. In other words, what is satisfying to the heart, to put it in softer language, and other means by which value or, quote-unquote truth is arrived at for individuals. So to say, quote, let those who are such be such, is to say, I'm content, I'm strong, I'm at peace with where I am, and other people, they may like it, they may not, they may do alike, they may do different. makes the difference to me. That one may feel compassion for another who may be on a path that is detrimental to them or is of lesser value. There is some scope of showing concern for others, but if that becomes excessive or one becomes preoccupied with the other to an unnecessary extent or to an excessive extent, this can also betray a lack of depth in one's own pursuit and in one's own depth of experience, conviction, knowledge, and so forth. So this statement is a statement, you could say, of maturity, where there isn't an attempt to deprecate the other. A lot of times when someone, can only see things one way, then they need to find fault in what is not their way. But those who have conviction in what they do, not simply based on a superficial or a overly simplistic idea of it being better than everything else, they can also recognize the merits in things that they may not follow. They can comfortably respect all qualities wherever they're found, no matter who they're found in, and they remain nevertheless firm and comfortable in their own position. So this is, you could say, a symptom of mature understanding, is one can respect others for what they are, treat them with respect, not feel the tendency to find fault in them or press upon what one perceives as the deficiencies in them. Simply let them be, respect them as they are, and in doing so, have therefore greater facility to absorb oneself in what one has found to be of true meaning and potential and value within one's own life. So, in other words, some may follow karma, some may follow gyan, let it be, let them carry on, and I shall follow the Bhaktas. I shall happily remain, in service to these persons who have brought me what I've found to be of ultimate value. So, anyway, this is some broader, application of the spirit of the verse, if you will. So there's a few more points in the commentary. The word padatrana literally means foot protection, and can be taken to mean shoes, that is, footwear, in the modern language, or can be taken, as the commentator interprets it, to mean, quote, protection afforded by the feet of servants of Hari from the snakes of samsara. So, the word padatrana, to say that we are adherents of the foot protection of Hari's servants. One way is to take it literally. We're adherents of the shoes. In other words, we hold the dust, the shoes, the things that are even lower than the feet of the Bhaktas on our heads. You can take it as an expression of respect. Or you could take it that the teachings, the grace that Bhaktas give is referred to or spoken of as the protection that is afforded by their feet. In other words, the benefit that they provide for people. So the other interpretation then is to say, we adhere to that support, that grace, that teaching, that protection that we've received from Bhaktas. We follow what Bhaktas teach rather than what Gyanis teach, rather than what Karmis teach. This is another way it can be interpreted. The word avalambaka, adherent, can literally mean one who does hanging or dependence, in the sense of one who depends on, follows, and takes up the support of something. Or can mean one who causes hanging, in the sense of one who upholds or supports something. So if you interpret the word avalambaka in the opposite way, then you can translate the verse loosely as follows. Some uphold gyan, some uphold karma. We, however, uphold the shoes of Hari's servants upon our heads. So in other words, you could take it as followers, or you could take it as like, we're putting forth, or we're, championing this, or holding this high as the ideal. So in that sense, we're holding up the feet of Hari's servants, we're worshipping Hari's Bhaktas, we're lionizing what grace they present. Oh, one sec here. So in conclusion, as per any of these interpretations, the verse conveys the greatness of Sri Bhagavan's Bhaktas by describing them as worthy of being taken shelter in, and capable of not only transcending samsara and reaching the ultimate spiritual attainment themselves, but also as being capable of leading others to that attainment as well. So when he's speaking about this protection of bhaktas, then this can allude to their capacity to benefit or uplift others in addition to their own exalted position of their own. So this concludes the prakaran on the greatness of bhaktas, and here with this point, exalting bhaktas in contrast to followers of other paths. But albeit, in a way that we intend to be respectful and not detrimental of the other paths in the process. So what they call nahi nindya nyaya, or this principle that something else, some reason for it not being best may be stated, but that reason is not stated specifically for the sake of deprecating something, or specifically for the sake of pointing out something negative, but rather for the purpose of exalting whatever it is that one considers most important. So in that spirit, these comments are made, and it's the quality of a bhakta as it's stated by Krishna in the Bhagavatam. One should have faith in the Shastra, or the Bhagavat Shastra, but not criticize other Shastras. So in other words, we want to arrive at a conviction in the path of bhakti that at the same time sustains respect for the value of all other paths. So in that spirit, we discuss these things today. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or anything else, please feel free. Yes?
Question.
Okay.
Did you say that Upanishads don't represent Advaitavad or Brahman?
Sorry, who?
Upanishads.
The Upanishads.
Yes.
People interpret the Upanishads to convey that. So
depending on the school, they interpret differently.
Right. From the Bhakta perspective, we take it two ways, so to speak. We recognize that Nirvishesh Brahman is undoubtedly described there and presented as an object of pursuit, but we'll also consider that many of the statements in the Upanishads which speak of Brahman or Para-Brahman are also referent to the ultimate aspect of the Paratattva, which from our perspective will be Bhagavan, Swayam Bhagavan. So that persons may, on the basis of the Upanishads, pursue realization of Nirvishesh Brahman, or pursue realization of some form of Savishesh Brahman, or pursue realization of our favorite Savishesh Brahman, Shri Krishna. For us, all of the above are considered acceptable in terms of them being paths that are chalked out in the Shastra, and therefore worthy of respect, and that will lead to someone reaching an attainment which is not detrimental to anybody else, and completely fulfilling without any, negative consequence for them. So it won't hurt them, and it won't hurt others, and they'll be happy. So we respect it. But we also see that there's a gradation in how happy things can become in the spiritual plane, so we have preference for what we understand to be, rasa or ananda in the ultimate sense. But nevertheless, if due to the association, the fortune, the samskar, etc. of a person, they're oriented such that they're pursuing some other feature of the Parabrahman, let it be. We respect that. We don't want to deprecate that in any way. All right, so I'll conclude here for today. Jai Guru. Jai Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Jai Radhe.